Hello there, and a huge welcome to today's episode of Gina Gardiner and Friends. Although today's episode is going to be very different because for once I've not invited any friends. You're just going to get me. Because it struck me that although I've done hundreds of interviews on Brushwood Media and before that on other radio shows, I haven't actually shared my story. And I thought over the next few weeks, I'd like to share with you not only my story, but the work that I do and my approach to life, because ultimately I'd like to get to know you better. And in order to do that, you need to get to know me better. I also want to share with you some of the things that I've been doing and some of the things that I offer, because ultimately, if you are a business leader, a leader, in fact, or someone who wants to develop personally and professionally, then I have a whole range of programs and products and services that I can offer. And I thought over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to do 4 programs. Today is going to be all about my story, and then I want to take different aspects of life and to share with you the principles that I live by and some of the strategies that I use both for myself and for clients. But today is about my story, and I've been around a long time. I'm 72, and although I like to think of myself as being young, certainly young at heart, when I look in the mirror, I can see that time has definitely passed. I was born in Urmston Cottage Hospital, which is on the outskirts of Manchester. And I am the second child of my mum and dad, Celia Gardiner and Peter Gardiner. My sister Paulette, known as Polly, is 3.5 years older than me. Now, my dad had 6 weeks to do in the reservists after the Second World War, and soon after my sister was born, he was sent off to Korea. That's a whole different story in itself. So when he arrived back and I arrived on the scene, I was very much close to my dad. He'd missed the first 18 months of my sister's growing up, and so he made up for it with me. And I was very much a tomboy, and I think my mum and dad wanted a boy. And when I was 7, he arrived, David. And ultimately, he was someone that was very special, but sadly, he died when he was 49 very suddenly. More of that later. We lived in Manchester, which in those days was very different. My mum talks about the fact that when they moved to Manchester, her and my dad, she found it very difficult because people were incredibly friendly, one might say over friendly. In those days, it was the tradition that if you had a concrete windowsill and a concrete step, then you were expected to chalk it. Of course, as soon as somebody stood on that, you'd have a footprint. And my mum had a deputation of neighbours who said, "Why aren't you chalking your step?" And my mum said, "Well, because as soon as somebody steps on it, you've got a footprint. I keep it clean, but I'm not going to chalk it." And she found that every morning somebody had chalked her step. And she also talks about stories of waking up to the smell of bacon and coffee because somebody had come in, seen that they were in bed, and actually thought that they would make them breakfast because nobody locked their back door. And my mum found that very intrusive. And so by the time I was 6, my parents had decided that they were going to move south. And we moved to Stevenage. And Stevenage at that time was a very new town. There was the old village, and it was one of the initiatives that the government created to actually provide housing to get people out of London. We moved to Stevenage, and my address was 5 Little Hyde, Half Hyde, the Hyde. And it was there that my brother was born. My dad was a teacher. He taught at Pear Tree Spring Junior School. And I had the dubious privilege of having my dad as my class teacher. I found that quite challenging because in order for him not to be seen as giving favoritism, he was a very hard taskmaster. Now, my dad taught after he left the army. He was an emergency trained teacher, and he taught until he was 73. And if I go back to the end of my teaching career, and I'm getting ahead of myself, the kids used to love my dad He was very, very strict. And they talked about his eyebrows, which as he got cross, which he didn't do very often, but he did magnificently, his eyebrows would come out, a bit like Dennis Healey, for those of you who know that the British politician from a while ago. And as one of my children at school said, his eyes breathe fire. Well, when I was in his class, his eyes breathed fire quite a lot. My parents were going to move to Australia and they had sold everything. My dad had given up his job when my mum was taken ill, and so was my little brother. And so they decided that they weren't going to go to Australia after all. But of course, my dad had no job because in England, you give your notice in by May the 31st for the September term. If you have given your notice in, then there is no job. Fortunately, they gave him a job for a term, and he was looking around the country for a job, primary or secondary. He was experienced in both. And so we ended up in a place called South Ockenden. And South Ockenden is quite a challenging area. We always used to get a tied house with the job. And my parents decided that they wanted something different. And so, for the first time ever, my mum went out to work. She was a court dressmaker. She'd worked before she was married, and she was the most amazing dressmaker. Um, but she went out to work. And so within 5 years, they'd saved up for the deposit, and we moved to Hornchurch, which is still in Essex, but in a very different sort of area. A bit about my mum. My mum was sent to boarding school at the age of 6 because her father, a master tailor, was a gambler, and the family lived with feast or famine. And one of the uncles paid for my mum to go to boarding school, and she went at 6. She came back home at the age of 18, never having visited in the middle. She was, as I say, a court dressmaker. So when I was growing up, particularly in my teenage years and my 20s, I'd say to my mum at about 4 o'clock, I don't know what I'm going to wear tonight. And my mum would say, go and choose a piece of material. I would cook dinner and my mum would make me an outfit, and I'd go off in that outfit by 6:30, 7 o'clock. And it would be something that she had designed and made. She never used a pattern, she just used a tape measure and a piece of tailor's chalk. So we moved to Hornchurch from South Ockenden, and in both schools, in South Ockenden and in Hornchurch, I was very unhappy at school. I didn't feel as if I fitted in. I spoke as I do now, and people thought I was being posh and unfriendly. And so I very much felt on the outside. And when I went to secondary school, because I was so unhappy, I used to comfort eat. And so I put on weight. And I also developed really bad eczema. And eczema is one of those conditions that itches like the very devil. And I used to have to wear white cotton gloves for school. You can imagine what that's like as a teenager, can't you? Because the eczema on my hands was so bad. Hospitalized with it three times. And one of the most challenging things was that at that time, I wanted to be a cookery teacher. I was very good at cooking. In fact, it was my salvation, really. I used to escape to the cookery room at break time and lunchtime, got on well with both cookery teachers in both schools, and used to cook their dinner for them. And so, very experienced in cooking. Once my mum went out to work, I would cook for the family during the week. And I wanted to teach cookery and English, which is of those days not the usual mix. If you did cookery, you usually do needlework. Now, I can't tell you how bad I am at needlework. You know, I spent a whole year creating a nightie, which is basically 4 seams. And by the time it came home, instead of being the pretty yellow the material was to start with, it was a grubby grey. It was misshapen. My sister said she liked the pattern. They went down to the material shop, bought the material, came back. My mum had made 2 nighties. And all of that, the walking, the buying, the walking back, and the making, was done in an hour and a half. And I decided at that point, well, I don't think this is worth my time. Anyway, I digress. I got a place at college and I was looking forward to it, but my eczema was getting worse. And in the July, before I was due to start college in September, I was given the edict, if you like, that I couldn't take up my place to teach cookery because of the eczema, and I was so allergic to vegetables. I couldn't peel vegetables, couldn't rub my hands in water. At the time, I was absolutely devastated. I have to say, the universe did me such a favor because what I recognized when I finally did go to college that September, I did a primary secondary course and I realized that my calling was in primary school, where you teach every subject. I started teaching in 1974 when most of you weren't actually born. And I was at an amazing school with great people who acted as mentor. And within 3 years, I'd got promotion. And that was really, for the first 9 years of my teaching career, that was pretty much the way things worked. I got promotion very quickly. And by the time I was 28, I had become the deputy of the largest primary school in the local authority. Now, that wasn't quite plain sailing because in England in those days, and probably still is the case, that people will go and visit the school, talk to the head teacher or the principal before applying. So I rocked up at the school and I was told, don't apply, we want to appoint a man. Things were very different in those days, and it wasn't against the law to discriminate because of your gender. I looked round the school, very different to the one I was teaching in, which is only a mile away. So Morley School was my second school, and it had no green space. It was in a very deprived area. And Parklands, the school where I went to be deputy at, was very different. A mile down the road, two huge fields, lots of space. The classrooms were bigger, everything was very spread out. And so I decided, what have I got to lose? I'm going to apply. It's good experience if I get an interview. I'm going to go for it. And so I applied for the job. On the day of the interview, John Hughes, the head teacher, the principal, said to me, you do realise I want a man. And ultimately, if you are equal footing to another man, the man will get it. In order to get this job, you've got to really be head and shoulders above. And so I thought as I went into the interview, I've got nothing to lose here. I'm going to go and give it my best shot. If I don't get the job, well, I've had the experience. And so went into the interview. I left and I waited thinking, I'm going to hear, I'm not going to get the job. I was more than surprised when the phone call came and I was told I'd been successful. And so that September, I started at Parklands Junior School. I was the youngest on the staff, bar two. And what I discovered later was one of the reasons that the head teacher had said he didn't want to appoint a woman is because he told the interim deputy head that he was going to appoint a man. So please don't apply. Well, you can imagine that went down pretty well like a lead balloon. And it took me a good 5 years before she forgave me for, as she said it, taking her job. I was the youngest on the staff, bar two, and I was promoted to deputy head to be the catalyst for change. It wasn't a bad school, but it was very, very old-fashioned. You can imagine by this time I was 28 and I was the youngest bar two on the staff. It had a mature staff who were not used to change and pretty much hadn't changed for the last probably 20 years. We worked really, really hard to create a strategic plan to move the school forward. And in the UK, in February, we have a week's holiday. We call it a half term. Every term has 1 week in the middle called half term holiday. And at that time, I was a very keen skier. If I had the choice between a summer holiday and a skiing holiday, well, skiing won hands down. I'm not quite sure why. I don't like the cold, I don't like heights, and I'm not very sporty, but I loved skiing. And I was a pretty competent skier. In those days, it was the fashion to have skis that were as long as possible. And I convinced the man in the shop, or rather, the man in the shop convinced me, that I needed skis that were an extra 10 centimeters long. Well, it didn't quite work out as he'd thought. I've got my new skis. I've got a new ski suit, a very posh new ski suit, and off I went to St. Anton in Austria. Now, St. Anton's an interesting ski resort because it is said that all of the grading for the slopes are actually one lower than they actually are. The pistes are very narrow, very steep, and it's quite a challenging area to ski. That didn't worry me, or at least it didn't worry me before the extra 10 centimeters of ski, because for the whole of the week, what I proceeded to do was to wrap that 10 centimeters around my neck. And I had several falls. And on the Thursday, I had a pretty bad fall. I ripped my ski suit from thigh to ankle, and my earrings went through my ear, and I was pretty shaken up. One of the challenges was that I was with people who were good skiers, and under other circumstances, I could keep up with them. But because of these extra 10 centimeters and trying to go fast straight away before having got used to those extra 10 centimeters, I kept on crossing my skis and ending up in a heap. So I said to my friends, we were traveling home the next day, you know what, I'm not going to come and ski with you tomorrow. I'm going to ski. I'm going to take some gentle red runs and I'm going to just get myself, back to confidence. I'm going skiing with the borough ski party and 150 children in a few weeks' time. I just want to get used to these skis. I probably should, well, I know I should have done it and done that on the first day and got used to the skis before joining them. But they said to me, why don't you come and join us for lunch? And I said, that's great. And so I did. And they said, we've found this amazing new run, 6 kilometer red run. Come and join us. And I said, okay. It was a magnificent day. The sun was shining. The mountains looked amazing. The snow was sparkling. It was one of those clear, very special days when you can hear sounds from right the way down the valley. And as we went on up on the the chairlift, you could see the village receding until it looked like a toy village. And you could see people skiing on the slopes below, just like little ants, really. We got to the top of the chairlift and off we went. I was at the back. And we'd gone probably about 10 minutes and turned the corner when I then suddenly realized that they had stopped. And it was pretty evident they weren't where they thought they were going to be. So instead of being on this amazing 6 kilometer red run, we were at the top of what turned out to be a very significant black diamond run. Now, for those of you that are not skiers, the way it goes is learner slopes are green, then you progress to blue, then red, then black, then for the foolhardy, black diamond. Black diamond means it's very steep, it's very difficult. And what had happened on this slope is it was full of what we call moguls. And that's where the snow has been carved by the weather. And moguls can be a couple of inches, a bit like cobbles if you've ever walked across a cobbled street. But these were 6-foot monsters. And the only way you could ski was to turn on the top of the mogul, slide down, ski between them, and then get onto the top of another mogul and then turn to go the other way. Either side of this very steep mogul field, there was powder snow. So I skied about a third, and I was a very accomplished skier prior to the extra inches of centimeters on my skis. And I skied the first third of this very long black diamond run. And then I didn't quite turn in time. And I ended up in the powder snow, which was either edge, and I fell. And I fell some considerable distance. In the meantime, my friends had skied further down and they had decided to stop and wait for me, each of them sitting on a mogul, rather like an elf sitting on a mushroom. And it took me about 20 minutes to ski down to them. And they were all sitting there laughing. And I sat down on the mogul and I took my skis off. Hadn't been there very long when suddenly the top of the mogul gave way and I began to fall. And as I rotated out and bounced, there was nowhere to land. And the last thing I remember is hearing a scream and everything going black. When I came to, I was pretty much at the end of the slope. I have no idea how long it took my friends to ski to me. All I know is that other skiers, one by one, brought me different bits of gloves, my stick, my glasses, my hat. And by the time the friends got down to me, I had come to, and I felt as if I'd been run over by a bus. I recognised that in knocking myself out, I'd probably given myself a chance not to be either killed or paralysed. I'm a pretty determined person. My mum calls me bloody minded. And I didn't want the blood wagon. So with their help, I got back to the hotel. And as I said, by the time I'd finished that fall, I was pretty much at the end of the slope. And that was at the edge of the village. Fortunately, our hotel was that end of the village. I had a very difficult night. I was tossing and turning. I kept reliving the fall. And then we travelled home the next day. My mum took one look at me and I was dragged off to accident and emergency, where they diagnosed that I'd got a bad concussion and that I had trapped a nerve in my neck and that I was to go home and I was to rest. Well, Monday morning came and I tried to go to school and I was just talking rubbish. Now, there are those who would say I talk rubbish most of the time, but this was rubbish like no other. Sent home, and it took me 3 weeks to get back to school. And I was still wearing a surgical collar, and I wasn't right. But the ski party that I was the deputy of was going another 3 weeks later. And the week before we were due to go, I was given the all clear to go, even though I wasn't right, because we had a medic going with us. And so on this occasion, we were skiing in Switzerland, in Morges. It's great for the kids because it's right on the border between France and Switzerland. So the children love, I'm skiing in France, I'm skiing in Switzerland, skiing in France, skiing in Switzerland. But as the week went on, I became more and more like Quasimodo. And by the Friday, particularly after the children had all done their races and we were back into the hotel, I really had to go and lie down. And I said to my colleagues, I'm sorry, I can't help supervise the meal. I've just got to go and lie down. Now, it was quite an inexpensive hotel, and so it was bunk beds. How I got onto the top bunk, I have no idea. But I did. And within half an hour, what I realised is I was paralysed down one side. I couldn't move one side of me at all. I was frightened. But I didn't want to raise the alarm. Children were playing in the corridors, and I was really mindful that if I shouted out, then I was going to panic them. And so I had to wait for somebody to come to the room. And that, I think, is the longest time in my life. My body wasn't doing what I wanted it to. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't feel I could shout out. Just imagine what it's like when suddenly half your body's not working. Eventually somebody came, took one look at me, all hell broke loose, and they called an ambulance and I was carted off to the local hospital and then within a very few hours carted off to the university hospital. And I was there for just over a week, having all sorts of tests and so on. They flew me home, back into hospital for another 3 weeks. And I finally got back to school at the end of May. And I wasn't right. I did school, came home, went to bed, went to school, came home, went to bed. And I just managed to get to the end of the summer term, which in the UK is around the 19th, 20th of July. We have 6 weeks summer holiday, and I was really chuffed to have got there and recognised that I had now 6 weeks that I could rest and recuperate and get myself sorted out. So by September, I could be fully fit. First few days, I did exactly that. And then On the eighth day, very, very early in the morning, I received a telephone call. And it was from my head teacher, my principal's wife, and she was hysterical. And it took me a while to work out what she was saying, but it turned out that John Hughes, the head, the principal, lovely man, had died in his sleep. And she'd woken up to discover her husband dead in bed with her. I raced round there. I helped her sort out and organise the funeral. I had to let the staff, the local authority, the parents know. And so far from it being a quiet holiday, it was very busy. And I also had to prepare to be acting head, acting principal in the September. September dawned, and in those days, the incumbent deputies were not allowed to apply to be the head teacher first time round. And so the first round of interviews went, and they didn't appoint. And then I was asked if I'd like to apply. Now, bearing in mind, I had 1 year as a deputy, and of that, pretty well a term where I had not been either at school or operating on all cylinders. I applied. I was 29, and in January 1984, I became the head teacher, the principal of a school, big school. And although I was enthusiastic and I was determined that everybody in that school, children, teachers, parents, an associated local area, that I would do the very best that I could for all of them. My health was very, very much compromised by what had gone on. For me, the deciding factor was, so long as school was not compromised in any way, then I would do the job and I would give it my all. I was the head teacher there for just over 20 years. And in that time, the school developed a whole range of things that weren't existing when I first arrived. And I'm going to talk to you about those through the break. But I want you to recognize that it's not the challenge that defines you, it's what you do with it. And I have to say, over the years, that my physical health, particularly my mobility, has been an incredible challenge. But at the same time, it's been my greatest gift. And I think for anybody listening, we've only touched the surface so far. There's lots more to come. But ultimately, please take on board as you listen to the rest of today and to my other episodes about me, is that you are the common denominator that you take into your life every moment of every day, and that you have a choice whether you want to be a victim what's going on, or whether you want to be the champion, the hero, the heroine, the person who takes control of their life. And I made a decision very, very early on that I was going to write my life story and I was going to be the heroine of my life story. I wasn't going to be a victim. Now, does that mean that there weren't days when I was fed up, depressed, upset? 1 or 2 days where I felt really hopeless? No, though all of those things were true. But for me, making sure that the school did well, that the children were happier at school than I'd been at school, that the staff were working together and doing the best they could. And I'd worked in 2 schools where the head teachers were very good role models of how not to lead. And I'd seen the difference between great teachers who were motivated, enthusiastic, caring, and teachers who weren't. And I was determined that every teacher, every non-teacher within the school was going to be, as I felt they ought to be, the leading professional in whatever they did. And so when I was appointed, the one thing that was clear to me is, how do I create the best learning opportunity for everyone? I'm a very new head. I've got a woman on the staff who was told not to apply because they wanted a man. I'd had a bit of time with her as a deputy head, but you can imagine, not only was I the deputy head and she didn't get the job, now I'm the head teacher or principal. and she was not a happy bunny. So I had inherited a staff that were used to doing things in a very, very specific way. And I want to share a couple of examples with you because part of the challenge was, how do I get these people on board when they are stuck in their ways? And it would be very easy to go wag my finger and say, you've got to do it this way. But I knew that if I wanted it to be embedded and for people to take ownership, I really needed to do this in a careful and canny way where people took ownership. The best idea is the one that people think they've had, but ultimately that they can feel that they have ownership of the vision of the what you're trying to achieve, and that they know that their contribution is being hugely valued. The library in the school, and I believe that the library ought to be, a central hub of the school, was bizarre. The teacher who was in charge of the library had decided to classify the books by the colour of their spine. So all of the whites, the creams to yellow to orange, pink to red, pale lilac to mauve, grey to black, beige to brown. They were all organised by the colour of the spine. So you'll appreciate nobody could find anything. If you wanted to pick a random book, fine. But if you wanted to find a book on dinosaurs or on the body systems, or you wanted to find a novel by a particular author, no chance. Added to this, this particular teacher was known as the Welsh Dragon, and she had a reputation for having a temper and for being really quite difficult. In fact, according to legend, she had put her foot through the floor at one point and made a hole in the floorboards when she stamped her foot. This is all the more amazing when you know that this is a lady who was 4 foot 9.5. She was tiny but formidable. So I thought, how am I going to do this? So what I decided to do was to talk to the borough librarian and say, which are the 3 best school libraries? And she identified those. And I spoke to the head teacher, their principals, and said what was going on. And that would they ask their librarian, that in those days, the schools rarely had a designated librarian. It was usually a teacher with responsibility for the library. Would they meet with my teacher? And they all agreed. She didn't drive at that time, so I drove her. I went and had a cup of tea with the head teacher while she went to the library and spoke to the librarian. As we left the first school, I had to sit on my tongue because I was desperate to say, what do you think? What do you think? Wasn't it good? But I just said, did you have a good time? She said yes, and she was very quiet. And we talked about the weather and just general things. A few days later, I took her to the second school, and history repeated itself. I went to speak to the head, she went to the library, and on the way home, so again, I kept quiet. I didn't push. Then we went to the third school, and I was getting a bit desperate by that time. What's going to happen? Is this going to backfire, or is she going to take things on board? And on the way home from that particular visit, she said to me, how would you feel if I Dewey System the library? If I got some parents in and we organised them? You know about the Dewey System, don't you? It's all done by numbers and categorising by subject. I said, Lena, that would be a fabulous idea. She got some parents together. Within 6 weeks, the library was Dewey Systemed. I'd given her a budget to spend on refreshing the shelves and so on in the library, and also buying some new books. And the library became something that everybody could use and everybody could be proud of. That taught me a huge lesson. My theory was that people needed to take ownership. But in that example, you can see that if I'd gone in and said to her, I want it Dewey Systemed, she would have done it. But it was very different because it came from her. Her initiative, she took charge, she took ownership. And it established very early on in my career that to be a great leader, You need to share the vision and be very clear about the vision and why that's important. But you also need to engage people in such a way that they feel they have a contribution to make and that they have ownership of that contribution. Now, I was the head teacher at that school for just over 20 years, as I've said. But on the health front, in those first 5 years, I kept on having tests because my mobility was deteriorating. And although I could walk, I could only walk very short distances. And by the time we'd got to 1987, I was struggling to move between classrooms, between my office and the hall, between the hall and the canteen, because the school was very spread out. But I resisted getting a wheelchair. And it came to the summer holidays, and friends had said, we're going to Wisley, which is a very famous gardens, the Royal Wisley. And I love my garden. I call it the window of my soul. I love being out there and working the soil and planting. And we got to the car park, and in those days, as I said, my mobility was deteriorating, but I wouldn't use the wheelchair that was on hire. I was so pig-headed, so blindsided that I didn't want to admit defeat, that if I went into a wheelchair, my thought process is if I went into a wheelchair, then I was admitting I was disabled, and actually from there on it would be a downward spiral. And so I sat in the car park for 2 hours while they went and looked round the gardens. It just so happened at that particular time, I had started an experimental drug therapy. So 6 weeks of one tablet, and then you were to add the other tablet in. When I got home, I took the second tablet, and within 24 hours, I was in hospital, and I was really poorly. And I didn't come out of hospital for 4 months. By the time I came out, I was 7 stone. I'm 5'6.5". I looked like something out of Belson. And I couldn't walk more than a couple of steps. And so I had to use a wheelchair. And what I recognized was, far from it being the limitation, that having a wheelchair, and in those days I just used the wheelchair to get me from office to the hall or office to the classrooms. And for a few years, I could actually walk inside the hall, walk inside the classrooms. But I couldn't do the distances in between. And in the hall, I had a stool at standing height, so that I could sit while I took assembly, things like that. But again, my mobility was significantly deteriorating. And then in 1996, I sneezed as I was pricking out some plants in the garden, leaning forward over a table, and I heard something ping in my back. And for a few days, I was hobbling around. I had really bad sciatica, didn't think too much of it because that was something that I experienced on a pretty regular basis. But by the last day of the summer term, I was really struggling. I did the final assembly, went to stand up, and I found that my legs wouldn't hold me. Was taken to the local GP, who said that I had slipped a disc. Went home. By the following morning, I was in trouble. And I phoned a friend who came, phoned the ambulance, and I was taken into hospital. And they discovered that a disc had exploded. And so I had to have the disc removed. When I came to, within 24 hours, they want you up and standing. The minute I put my left foot to the floor, I fainted because of the pain. And that became the pattern, that I could not put my foot to the floor. I couldn't bear anything touching my left leg because the pain was so excruciating. The doctor, his response was, well, your operation was a complete success, my dear. It's you who's the failure. Not helpful. And so I became a very good stalk. I could stand on one leg and I could do all sorts of things on one leg, but what I couldn't do was walk. I was already using an electric wheelchair in school to get me from A to B. And so I then started to use the electric wheelchair all the time. And pretty soon after I came out of hospital, I was back at school. It took me 18 months, three guanethidine blocks, several spinal blocks before the hypersensitivity was reduced enough for me to start to walk. And it took 18 months from the operation, the first operation, to be able to walk to the bottom of my pretty small garden. Still used a wheelchair at school, still used a wheelchair to go out and about. Last day of the summer term, 2 years on from the first disc that had been ruptured, we went out for a staff night out. We went and had a meal out. And when I got home, I didn't feel very well. And I vomited. And as I vomited, I felt something in my back go. What I didn't realize is I'd ruptured another disc. Following morning, again in a terrible state, phoned a friend, phoned the ambulance, taken into hospital, more surgery. This time when I woke up, I could not stand at all. On both occasions, I'd got what they called or told me was failed back surgery syndrome. By this time, it's 1998, and although I'd used a wheelchair since 1987, now I'm completely and utterly wheelchair bound. I can't put either foot to the floor. I have to use a transfer board. I can't do anything. I got released from hospital, and within 4 or 5 days, I was back at school part-time. 5 or 6 months later, the consultant said to me, I think we might talk about you going back to school part-time. And I just laughed. I said, I've been back since a week after I came out of hospital and after 3 weeks back full-time. And I said to him, I could stay at home. I could watch daytime TV. I have to say it doesn't do much for me. I could read. I couldn't make a drink unless my carer had left something out on the side, filled the kettle. So I could stay at home and face being disabled, or I could go into school, do something useful, something that I loved and enjoyed, and have other people make the cup of coffee or reach down a book from the shelf. But I could be useful. My brain, my eyes, my hands, and certainly my mouth worked. And so, what would you do? Would you stay at home, or would you go and do a job you loved that you felt was useful? Now, I know it's not for everybody, and there are those that are probably quite rightly would say, well, you were a bit stupid to do that, but it was the right thing for me. And so within a few days of coming out of hospital, I was at school. As I said just before the break, for 20 years I ran that school, and for the most part I ran it from a wheelchair. And there were certain challenges. I couldn't physically get my chair into most of the classrooms, and if I could get the chair inside the door, I couldn't get round the classrooms. So I had to find a way of developing my staff in such a way that they would take radical responsibility for themselves and a shared responsibility for the team. And that required a whole range of training development. I had set up a training for probationers long before it became a statutory requirement by the government. And I had noticed that people who had been teaching for 3 to 5 years had really got it sussed, but those first 3 years were a bit rocky for the kids. And I thought, how can I bring that sense and that experience further forward? And so I set up a 2 year program called The Next Step. So a year's probationary training straight into the next step. I determined the the criteria and the curriculum for that, and staff would come once a month and have extra training in terms of all sorts of things, such as marking and assessments and discipline, all sorts of things. Now, in the UK, teachers give in their notice. They give their notice in 3 times a year, and in the summer term, they have to give their notice in by the 31st of May. And head teachers, principals dread that last couple of weeks when people come and use a voice. Gina, can I have a word? Because you pretty well know that that means that they're going to look for promotion. And one of the challenges for my school was they'd always get promotion because they had such a good training. And so in that week, I had 5 people come and say to me, Gina, I thought, what am I going to do? I can't afford to leave 5 people. Our budget was such that I couldn't promote them. We had a very flat management structure because our budget was so bad. And so I said to them, go and have a look at the school. If you like the school and you think the school will give you the opportunity to develop well, go with my blessing. I'll give you a great reference. But if you stay, I will create a training program for you so that when you do leave, you can go on to the next level, and that you will have had the best possible grounding that I can give you. All 5 stayed. Incidentally, 3 became deputies, 2 became heads or principals, and I created a program, they called it the Next Generation. Now, rather than me create the curriculum, they determined the things that they felt would be useful. And I'd said right from the outset, if I can't deliver it, then I'll find somebody who can. But one of the things I was doing at this time, because our budget was so bad, is that I was going out to earn an income. And I worked for the National College of Leadership, the London Institute, as a trainer facilitator around leadership. We had become a beacon school for leadership and so worked with many other schools and teachers. Was a workforce reform advisor for the government, threshold assessor, Ofsted inspector, only one of them at a time, but you'll appreciate 20 years is a long time. And so I was able to bring that knowledge of the training for those different roles and my engagement with these bastions of education so that I could constantly bring in the new and move things forward. As a result, the school did incredibly well. We had lots and lots of accolades. We were investors in people. We were a beacon school. Um, uh, we had a whole range of accolades for um, environmental studies, for English, for arts, for sports. And because we were big and because teachers took such great delight in their responsibility, we had 50 clubs and activities that the children could engage in. We had 2 choirs, we had an orchestra, all of the sports that you could think of, arts, chess, you name it, we had it because every member of staff ran at least one club, and that's true of the non-teaching staff as well. We had a garden, we had a nature reserve, we had animals, we had Sally the school cat, goats, chickens, ducks, rabbits, guinea pigs. And so children had the broadest possible education. I'd always done senior management training, and then my middle manager said, well, what about us? And so what I did is set up a mentor training. And we became one of the few schools that could do training for teachers who'd got a degree but wanted to change that into the opportunity to become a teacher without reference to a university, which is very unusual. And so my mentor group became the mentors to students. And so everybody in the school was involved. And then the other thing that I did is I had what I called a general management team, and anybody on the staff could be part of that. They had to come on for a year. They couldn't pop in and pop out. And decisions which could be then put before that group, always with the caveat that this is negotiable, that's not. Those people, whether they were teaching or non-teaching, could be part of that group and be engaged and see how the management and leadership within the school worked. I was very fortunate that being in that school, having the opportunity, very different to now because things have become so set and so examination oriented. And although we did have SATs, and of course it was important that the standards were kept high and improved upon, because we had such a broad base and because every teacher was engaged in doing their very best and had a really clear understanding of what excellence was, the school thrived. The children did well, and they achieved not only academically, but they achieved becoming confident and able to take on new things and ready to try. And within the school, one of the other things that I'm very proud of that we did that Romford, where my school was quite an aggressive area. And so I created a training program for my staff so that we could say we have no tolerance of aggression. And because of that, we had to be squeaky clean. And so ultimately, that if you had a parent or a child who was being aggressive, we didn't want to meet fire with fire. We wanted to be able to downgrade that aggression. And we taught our children and the parents, so long as you come and talk to us reasonably, we will listen. If you're shouting and hollering, then it's very difficult to listen. But make no mistake, we will listen. Won't always promise to do exactly what you want, but we will listen and we will take account of that. And so the school became quite an oasis. And before I finish and just give you a couple of things that I'd like you to think about whether you'd like a copy. On one particular day, a parent came in at the end of school. It was a dad. He was incandescent with rage. I had no idea why he was cross. And he came into my office and he sat down on the armchair. And as he did, a feather duster that inadvertently a cleaner had left behind popped from by the side of the cushion and popped up between his legs. I was a very new head and I was quite nervous of very difficult parents in those days. And I just lost it and I started to laugh. Fortunately, he started to laugh too. Otherwise, it could have been very different. And it turns out that we'd had the Royal Ballet come to look at children any child that had a particular physical ability in terms of flexibility and grace and poise and so on. And he had received a letter from the Royal Ballet inviting his son to come to an audition. He thought that tacitly we were suggesting that his son was gay. And you've got to think about 1984, things were very different in the UK around sexuality. And he was very angry because he felt that was a slur on his son. We pointed out that actually it was simply that his son was very sporty, very flexible. It was an opportunity for his son, which he could decide for his son to take up or not. He went away. I'm not sure he was absolutely convinced, but ultimately he went away calmly. Now, I'm at the end of today's show, and I just shared with you really about the school part of my life. But I left school in 1980. I left school, sorry, in 2004, and there's so much more to talk to you about, but you'll have to wait till the next show. Now, before I go, I want to tell you about a leadership blueprint that I've created, and it's about leading your own life. It doesn't matter whether you're a leader or not. This is suitable for everybody. It's looking at your beliefs, your thoughts, your values, the way in which you operate. And I'm very thrilled to be able to offer you a free PDF. All you need to do is to email me, Gina Gardiner and friends @gmail.com, and put in the subject line blueprint. And I'll happily send you a copy of that. And that leads to a free mastermind. The next one is going to be in September. And if you would like to go to the mastermind, put blueprint and mastermind in the subject line. And we will make sure that you get the PDF and that you get a link to the mastermind. Now, I've done this at no charge, and I've done it with no charge because I want it to be open to everybody. All you've got to do is email. That's GINA GARDINER, the word and, the word friends, @gmail.com. That's Gina Gardiner and friends @gmail.com. Now, the next installment of this is going to be when I leave school. And there have been so many things that have happened since 2004, not least of which I've had an internal spinal stimulator fitted, and far from being completely wheelchair bound, although I still use a wheelchair out in town or going on holiday, I can now walk. And that was a real game changer for me. So I look forward to seeing you on the next show next week. Gina Gardiner, part 2. Take care. Bye bye now.